Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and turn on my video also. Let's see. Oh no, you're looking at a chipmunk or something. How do I turn it around?
Cute checkmark anyways.
My son's toy. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure how to flip the camera.
Okay. Do you have a presentation or anything?
I just have a statement, testimony I'd like to read, and then there is a slide that I would like to show.
Okay. So if you want, go ahead and read your statement, and then does Shauna have the slide?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so then we can go ahead and we can load that slide, and then in the meantime, if you want to go ahead and share your testimony.
Okay. Okay, Humbiakindi, with your respect, Madam Chair Rubio, members of the committee, and to whom it may concern, my name is Beata Sosi, and I am here today representing Table Women United and as an impacted citizen residing in Santa Clara Pueblo. As Table Women living downwind and downstream from Los Alamos' nuclear weapons production, we are very concerned about the lab's intentions to go forward with releasing radioactive tritium vapor into our air, land, waters, and ecosystems in 2 days. Once released, it is then a direct impact on organic compounds, which justifies oversight from this committee. During early fall is when our land-based community is outdoors for long periods of time, bringing in the harvest, drying food, processing, harvesting winter medicines, still working in the fields and gardens, even planting our winter crops. What will it mean to also have cumulative and multiple exposures when we consume these crops in addition to the legacy waste issues? There are also increased exposures due to active foraging of wild plants, gathering of clays, fishing, hunting, and ceremony. High winds are also a concern at this time. Our way of life is land-based and seasonal activities happen throughout the year. There is never a time when releasing toxicity into our habitat has less of an impact. It is our way of life that gives us strength, yet also puts us at an increased risk living next to an industry that causes ongoing harm to our environment, of which we continue to exist as part of, not separate from. This way of life is not taken into consideration in any science at the labs. Our children are also outdoors for longer periods of time due to the school shutdown for COVID-19, which is scheduled to go on indefinitely. We watch our children playing in their yards, exploring the arroyos, running, getting out of breath, and breathing deeply the air that we need to know is safe for them to be exposed to. Some of us live 20 minutes away from these planned releases, and now in addition to an already stressful quarantine and shutdown in our pueblo, there's added worry about our family being outside enjoying their birthright. It is understood that in the documents submitted to the EPA and NMED in 2018, there is no inclusion of alternatives to these releases. There should not be a rush to put our communities in harm's way when all solutions have not even been discussed. It is a matter of environmental justice that Indigenous peoples are included in government-to-government consultation and the public process is enacted that is thorough. It is values of care, love, and respect that are severely lacking when it comes to implementing protocols that do no harm on our peoples or environment. Why does profit and convenience continue to be enabled over human health and the consideration for future generations by regulatory and permitting agencies? This proposed venting at the minimum must be in an enclosed structure. The practice of evaporation of contaminated waters into our skies is one example of many that has been going on far too long at Lanol. I know that federal standards for tritium exposure are not protective of land-based people of color or pregnant families and infants who are more vulnerable to radioactive toxicity. Tritium can cross placental boundaries. These standards of exposure are still based on an obsolete model of an adult white male of European descent and custom. Dr. Makajani of the Institute of Environmental Energy and Research states, since tritiated water is processed by plants, animals, and humans like ordinary water, the tritium in it can become transformed into other chemicals such as proteins needed by the body. It can become part of the DNA. It can affect developing fetuses. Unfortunately, many of these effects, such as miscarriages and early pregnancy that may be induced by exposure of pregnant women to tritiated water, have not been well studied. The combined effects of in utero exposure to substances such as tritium combined with endocrine disrupting chemicals such as dioxins or PCBs are also not well understood. Why are we constantly put at risk when our safety and that of our unborn babies is not guaranteed? What the NNSA deems acceptable levels of exposure are not acceptable to us or our lifeways as Indigenous peoples. The water cycle is a precious resource that Lanol endangers and indeed has already contaminated with their legacy. This water cycle also includes those first waters that we are born from. Our pristine Tewa Cathedral now requires a commitment of generations of loving care and restoration, and Lanol and DOE has yet to be held accountable to enact full cleanup that is protective of our way of life and transition away from this constant violence on our lands and bodies. Tewa Women United submitted a petition containing 3,112 signatures garnered in a week to New Mexico Hazardous Waste Bureau Kevin Perard back in March, opposing the venting of flamed tritium waste containers at TA 54. Opposing these releases for the following reasons to reiterate. I will also note that TW did not receive a meaningful response or follow-up engagement. Tritium can be a radiation hazard when inhaled or ingested in food or water or absorbed through the skin. Tritium easily bonds with oxygen to form radioactive or tritiated water that living organisms, including fetuses, can uptake. Tritium can also cross placental boundaries. In addition, nearly all atmospherically released tritium gas is rapidly converted into tritiated water and thus can enter the food chain. Our land-based communities adjacent to Lanol are outdoors for longer periods of time in their fields and gardens, planting and harvesting. What will it mean to have cumulative exposure when people consume these crops? There must be an informed public process that prioritizes protecting those most vulnerable. We do not consent to these or other toxic releases in our ancestral homelands. It is the continuation of nuclear colonialism and violence on Indigenous lands and bodies, and a sorrowful history of environmental racism in our sacred Jemez and Pajarito Plateau. We call on all of our congressional delegation, EPA Region 6, the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Committee, NMED, and any other potential advocates to put an immediate halt and suspension to these planned tritium releases and any proposed increase in Lanol pit production. We are in support of the All Pueblo Council of Governors March press release requesting government-to-government consultation on this issue. We oppose any minimization of these impacts and demand free, informed, and prior consent. Our communities deserve reprieve, health, calm, and wellness in these challenging times. Thank you for your support and immediate actions to address the concerns of our community, assisting in stopping these planned releases, and halting an increase in pit production at Lanol. I ask that you center Navatoi Gia, landworker mother, and all of your decisions regarding oversight of this issue and others. So Navatoi Gia is the image that is shown on the screen, and this also shows the complete water cycle from river to clouds to rain to those waters that we were born from. So keep this in your mind and hearts. I ask this committee, Honorable Chair, in thinking about moving forward with any decisions regarding legacy waste, the issues that we've heard here today, if we begin to center Indigenous pregnant women and Indigenous pregnant families and all of our decisions and protocols moving forward, everybody will be protected. So that was my statement for today. Thank you very much. Kuntawaha.
Thank you, Beata. We'll if you can stay on, and then we'll do questions after everyone from the panel has spoken. In the meantime, Joni Ahrens, who's the Executive Director for Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety, if you can go next.
Next slide, please. I I was asked to speak about the protest by Santa Fe County and the Buckman Direct Diversion Board about excuse me, about the DOE and Los Alamos County application to the state engineer to transfer 679 acre feet year of water. And then I would like to add some information about the FY 2021 $100 million cut to Lanol cleanup, which will be a follow-up to some of the questions asked by the representatives and senators during the last session. And if there's time, I'd like to talk about the recent problems with Lanol's electronic public reading room. Next slide, please. So this photo is by Eddie Moore with the Albuquerque Journal. It shows, it's looking north, and it's showing the Rio Grande where the Buckman Direct Diversion Project. That project provides 40% of the drinking water for Santa Fe County and the city of Santa Fe. Morton Dead Canyon, where the chromium plume is located, is on the left side of the photo. Next slide, please. So I have a habit of reading the classified, or the classified ads, legal notices. And this was the legal notice that showed up on July 12th about Lanol's plans to transfer the 679 acre feet of water from the north and east sides of Lanol to the hexavalent chromium and co-located perchlorate plume. Next slide, please. This is so I got a hold of a copy of the application that was submitted to the state engineer and found handwritten notes on the application with no indication of who signed them. While the application indicates initials, it doesn't indicate whether these were Lanol initials or if they were from the state engineer. I was very concerned about this application moving forward, so I contacted my county commissioner, Anna Hansen, and asked her to please look into this. And I'll just say that Anna Hansen was the chair of the CCNS board in the early 1990s. Next slide, please. So one of the most important things that was not included in this application was a return flow plan, which would tell us what the impacts to the Rio Grande would be when 679 acre feet a year would be moved across the plateau. So Rick Carpenter, the facilities manager of the Buckman Direct Diversion Project, is quoted as saying, "If I had submitted an application that was as incomplete as this, I think I would have anticipated that somebody would have protested." Next slide, please. I just want to add before we go on that we're waiting for a decision from the state engineer about whether the state engineer, Mr. D'Antonio, will reject it or if he will accept it. We're also waiting to find out if DOE and Los Alamos County will withdraw their application. With respect to the proposed $100 million cut to the cleanup budget, which was discussed in the session before lunch. Generally, Congress provides between $200 and $225 million for cleanup activities. During the recovery money, the ARRA program in the late 2000s, Lanol received about $350 million, which made a profound impact on the ability to do cleanup. DOE is now proposing a $46 million cut, or 46% cut, or $100 million. The House has acted on the bill, but the Senate Appropriations Committee has not acted. We understand that there's going to be a continuing resolution. Next slide, please. $100 million cut while DOE is planning to ramp up plutonium pit production will result in more transportation to and from the Hill, more radioactive and hazardous waste generated and stored at Lanol, greater volume of water that will be discharged into the canyons that will flow eventually to the Rio Grande, and greater release of particulates and pollutants into the air, such as the tritium release that Ms. Sosi just described. I think one of the most important questions that the state and this committee should be asking is, on average, how many drums of true waste and low-level waste are generated by each pit that would be produced? Just on average, to give us a ballpark of what we can expect if these plans go forward. Next slide, please. And if the 100 million is not restored and actually increased to 350 million in terms of the total cleanup budget, so that we can actually make progress on cleanup, there's going to be challenges again to safety and health. Cleanup employment will decrease. There'll be less air and water sampling, less groundwater protection, and less remediation of the co-located hexavalent chromium and perchlorate plumes. Next slide, please. And just to give you some orientation about where the chromium plume is located, the Rio Grande is to the right of this slide. It's not shown. We see the boundary with the Pueblo de San Ildefonso. We see that the plume is changing shape, and it is of concern. I have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to go on and talk about what's happening with the electronic public reading room, and that's in my written testimony that I submitted. So what's happening is that under the hazardous waste permit, there's a section in the permit that says that the lab is required to establish an electronic public reading room where there's certain documents that are posted. And so we receive, as the public, once you sign up, receive a notice from the laboratory about the new documents. And there's a link in that notice so that you can click on it and go directly to the document. That was the old procedure. Now, the new procedure that's been in effect for a couple of months now, a message comes up on my computer that says, the link you just clicked seems to lead to another site than the link text indicated. This is sometimes used for tracking whether you click the link, or it could be a scam. So I haven't clicked on any of these documents, or if I have clicked on them, I have not opened them. So for example, the hazardous waste permit 10-year renewal application is available on the electronic public reading room. I haven't clicked on it because this message comes up. I don't want to be tracked by the Department of Energy or the NNSA or any of the contractors. I want to be able to go directly to that document without this, getting this message like we used to be able to do. I'm very concerned, CCNS is very concerned about the chilling effect this will have on public participation. This has not only happened with regard to the electronic public reading room, but also with regard to NEPA documents, such as the floodplain assessments. And with that, I thank the committee very much for this opportunity to present some of our community concerns about Lanol. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahrens. And just for the committee, Shauna has sent out a link on the handouts for Mrs. Ahrens' written testimony. It's posted on the webpage. Next, we have Greg Mello, who's the Executive Director of the Los Alamos Study Group.
Key points. I was at one time an environmental engineer and the first regulatory official who went to Lanol, but now we are looking more at fundamental issues, because the environmental issues which have been so ably discussed by the previous two speakers will not be resolved if Lanol's mission expands as planned. The first slide there talks about priorities, and I would like the committee to understand that that the military spending in the United States amounts to about $6,000 per household per year. So the military industrial complex gives and it takes away. We are concerned that New Mexico, our fundamental concern is that New Mexico is at serious risk of losing control over its destiny. Many people tell me that this has already happened, including some leading journalists, but we refuse to accept that and think that we can have a better future than Lanol is planning. Next slide, please. Our main concerns are here. First, that the Lanol expansion is very large. When I last spoke to this committee, it was about half this size. You're not getting the whole story here. So 30 pits per year was mentioned, but Lanol is under statutory requirement to surge to produce at least 80 pits per year. NNSA models that production at an average of greater than 100 pits per year. So this is Lanol's statutory responsibility in the 2019 Defense Authorization Act. And they are building and hiring for that large pit mission in competition with the site in South Carolina. The Environment Department has commented on the inadequacy of existing environmental analysis, and we concur with those comments. We are very concerned about the lack of transparency. We note that there is no useful, accurate, or current economic or environmental analysis of Lanol's programs. The committee is probably aware that Lanol commissioned a study which showed that the fiscal impact of Lanol is negative for all the counties surrounding Los Alamos County. Next, please. The Lanol has spent more than $100 billion. Next slide, please. In the region, but we don't have actually economic development. We have economic dependence, and that's a big difference. The difference between development and dependency is at the heart of our concern. We are quite concerned about what we might call a politics of nuclear mesmerization. And we always, of course, have corporate paternalism wherever there are polluting industries. And we are, to buy our gratitude and acceptance of these impacts. If the confidence and cooperation that we invest in Lanol were invested in our own institutions and our own universities, we would be a much stronger state. Next, please. We have unprecedented concern from elected officials in Los Alamos County. I've never seen this before. And the concerns are about transparency and environmental impact. Next slide, please. So what can be done? This committee can require transparency, as I hear many of you doing. We can demand a new open site-wide environmental impact statement, which is actually conducted by environmental and economic professionals, not by weapons administrators and their lawyers, which it's very clear that what we've seen so far has passed through a very fine legal mesh. Yes, NMED can provide stronger oversight. We are enthusiastic supporters of NMED, but their resources are limited, as we heard. Burdens of proof have to be thrown back on the lab to save the state's money. Yes, we should litigate for legacy waste removal, but this committee should understand, Madam Chairwoman, that the newly generated waste in support of national security missions has already been stated by DOE to take precedence over removal of legacy waste. It's not really, the biggest problem is not really cleaning up other sites. The biggest problem is that the plutonium in waste that's been removed from Los Alamos since WIP opened has been primarily on the order of approximately 80% from newly generated waste and not from legacy waste. Not exactly related to the lab, and that's the whole point. We now have an emergency in the state, an employment emergency, an economic emergency. We have to pull our attention as a state away from the lab and train and employ our young people and our unemployed in the kind of jobs that are weighted toward essential human and environmental needs and a resilience of our communities. We have this fascination with so-called high-paying jobs that don't create useful goods and services, but they will hurt our economy and our society through increasing inequality, despair, continued educational failure, and narrowing into this so-called pipeline to become plutonium fodder for Los Alamos. And we will perpetuate the present two-tier economy, which again hasn't been to the state's benefit. Okay, next slide. Briefly, what does Lanol do? There's a lot of confusion about this. Lanol is a weapons lab. That's, the other parts are ancillary, supportive, and most of them have to do with weapons one way or another. Next slide, please. I wanted to show two slides back to back. Next slide, please. So this was presented to this committee in August of 2019, but it was inaccurate. And it's, you know, it's annoying. We have 2 staff people, and Lanol has 13,000 staff people, and we wish that they could provide complete and accurate information to the state of New Mexico. Next slide, please. We go down to slide 10, please. There is at the moment no federal plan for pit production at Los Alamos. Slide 10, please. At the moment, there are only secret contractor proposals and reports. That is part of why we don't have a site plan, because that there is no signed federal plan for pit production. It is evolving. And as we see, it's actually secret. Now, this committee could probably see this to the extent that it's complete. To follow up from concerns that were expressed, Lanol used to produce an annual site plan, and then the changes and evolution that Director Mason was referring to would appear in the subsequent year's site plan. And every year, these would be put out for community discussion and so forth, but we have none of that now. Next slide, please. Some of the, this is from a presentation of the site plan that was given to more than 700 contractors on August 8th of last year. It has never been seen again. So this is a plan for a high bridge over the Rio Grande, roads through presently roadless areas to Santa Fe and connecting with I-25. Next slide, please. Interestingly, 7 months earlier, this plan was proposed by the Legislative Finance Committee. We just stumbled upon over this recently. Next slide, please. Well, then there are a few other slides that you'll see from that previous site plan. You can see the magnitude of it. Just to conclude, if we get to slide 21, that'll be the last one we can do. This plan dwarfs all previous infrastructure projects in the state of New Mexico. Thank you. The Elephant Butte Dam is about 2% in a constant dollar comparison to Lanol's capital program for this decade. All of the interstate highways together cost less than Lanol expects to invest in its infrastructure this decade. This is an enormous plan. We don't know what it is. We don't know the environmental impacts, either the direct or the indirect. And the state of New Mexico is in the dark, as our citizens. So anyway, thank you very much for your indulgence for the extra minute.
Thank you, Mr. Mello. For the committee, we'll move on to questions. If you have any, please raise your hand and I'll call you out. But first, we have Representative Chandler.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this course, thank you, panelists, for your presentation. I very much appreciate your time and attention to these important issues. This question is directed primarily at Mr. Mello. Hi, Greg. How are you?
To see you.
Great. Madam Chair, and Greg, if Lanol were not to engage in pit production, if some policy that remove that program.
I'm sorry, Mr. Mello, if you can put your mic on mute for now, because we're hearing you.
Yes, we're working on the video. It has always worked until this moment. I'm sorry, Madam Chair.
No, that's okay. But if you can mute,
broke your camera.
Just mute for now. Go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If pit production were taken off the table, would you have the same concerns about Lanol activity? Mr. Mello, Madam Chair.
Can you hear me, Madam Chair? Yes. Our concerns would be a good deal less. We would, pit production is the centerpiece of the proposed $1 billion year-on-year increase in Lanol's activities from a $3 billion to $4 billion laboratory. Any organization would have difficulty swallowing that big of an increase, and certainly the region as a whole. So while we generally oppose the nuclear weapons mission, the words of Lanol Government Affairs Director Carl Braithwaite come back that Lanol will be the dirty lab and Livermore will be the clean lab. We would prefer not to be a dirty lab.
Okay. So, you know, Madam Chair and Mr. Mello, I've known you for a long time. And when production was not on the table, I saw and heard a great deal from you on, we all did, the community, the public, the legislature, federal government, heard a lot from you on objections to lab mission. Am I forgetting some, misremembering things, Madam Chair, Mr. Mello?
No, your memory is approximately correct, I would say. Our concerns are heightened at this time. Pit production the mission was given to Lanol in 96-97 timeframe, but the magnitude, it was an industrial mission until really 2018, and then the passage of the NDAA for 2019, which was later that year in 2018. So it's gotten bigger.
Okay, so Madam Chair, Mr. Mello, your concerns are magnified. They reflect concerns you've had probably for, what, 30 years?
Yes.
More or less.
Exactly so.
Sorry to say, I've known you for 30 years. Not that I'm sorry that I know you, I'm just sorry that it's been 30 years. Can we talk a little bit about Sandia? Sandia's budget is also growing exponentially. Is that not right, Madam Chair, Mr. Mello?
Madam Chair, and it is in my understanding, but not as much as Lanol's. Lanol's growth is unique.
Well, Madam Chair, Mr. Mello, maybe we have different information and we'll get that clarified when Sandia comes. But my understanding is their budget will soon be approaching the $4 billion mark as well. And their hiring and so on is also at a very fast pace. Do you have similar objections to about the work of Sandia, Madam Chair, Mr. Mello?
Madam Chair, to clarify, I think that Sandia's growth is from a slightly larger baseline, so that at this point, Los Alamos is leapfrogging ahead or drawing even with Sandia, which has a greater funding stream from the Department of Defense as well as the Department of Energy.
Mm-hmm. True.
So
and Madam Chair, and also the intelligence community, I think they have a pretty strong. So it's also a defense lab, does a lot of defense work. So we have $3 to $4 billion enterprises in the state that are defense related or somehow related to that sort of mission. Is that not right, Mr. Mello, Madam Chair?
Yes, Madam Chair, it is correct. And we do have many of the same concerns regarding Sandia National Laboratory. The environmental footprint of Sandia, although it is greater than zero, it is considerably less than is Los Alamos's.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that point. I agree with you, Madam Chair and Mr. Mello. The environmental issues are different. Mission, very similar. Would you not agree, Madam Chair, Mr. Mello?
The thing which is distinguishing the two laboratories in a significant way is that while Sandia has a production mission, that production mission is of semiconductor parts. It's a relatively clean kind of mission. Lanol's production mission, which it hasn't had since the late 1940s, except for detonators, very small work, is really the dirtiest mission in the nuclear weapons complex.
Thank you for that. Just to clarify on the site plan, Madam Chair and Mr. Mello, and I really appreciate your information because I felt like I was being gaslighted a little bit there earlier, Madam Chair and Mr. Mello. I was like, I'm sure we've been talking about a site plan for the last 2 years. And so I thank you for at least reaffirming that I wasn't totally losing my mind. I appreciate that. I want to clarify the road. I saw your slide, Mr. Mello, Madam Chair, reflecting the money in the LFC budget. That was for 2019. It's not in 2020's budget. Is that not right, Madam Chair? Yeah, okay. So we agree. That's not in the budget any longer.
Yes.
Thank you for your information.
Briefly responding,
Sure.
Madam Chair, our concern about that is partly in the boldness of the proposal and its secrecy, and which is indicative of the kind of planning process and lack of transparency we see overall. And of course, the great environmental impact should something like that happen. I have talked to the Trump administration about the road, and and at the moment, the word was not one federal dime. We'll go into it. But we note that as one of Dr. Mason's slides indicated, there is a semi-crisis in craft workers. Dr. Bierschmidt has said in the past that approximately 80% of the craft workers at Los Alamos, I presume these are the subcontractors, are coming from Albuquerque. So they have to be put up in hotels and or have a face a 4-hour commute. So for that reason and for the lack of housing in Los Alamos County, we have a long-term concern that a connector road idea might be brought up again in the future.
If I could just really super quick, Madam Chair, and Ms. Mel, I completely agree with you on the road issue, and I completely agree that we need to have much more open discussions about site development and infrastructure at a magnitude that you're referring to. And I too was very concerned when that sort of just popped out of the blue. As the representative from Los Alamos, one would think I might know something about that, but I did not for quite a period of time. So if you ever hear anything more about it, Mr. Mello and Madam Chair, please contact me because I'm very interested in some of those issues. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm through with my time. Appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Representative. I don't have anybody else on the list to speak, but I do have some questions that I'd like to direct to Ms. Sosi. I really appreciate, well, all of your presentations. It's very, very helpful. But I am concerned regarding the venting that was, I think it was in March, we were told that some of the, I don't even know how to pronounce it, the tritium or tritium releases that were going to be vented. I know that there was a halt because of the COVID pandemic. Is that halt still in place?
We just received public notice today that the releases were being planned to start in 2 days. So I'm really concerned at the lack of public notice, given that the EPA did approve this back in August, I believe. So why the sudden short notice with the public? Why not the total lack of consultation with tribes?
Wow.
Yeah, so that's my understanding of moving forward.
Yeah, that was going to be my second question. So what I'm hearing you say is that they put a halt on the venting that was slated to begin in March, and you all just got notice that it's going to actually begin in 2 days.
Yes, correct.
Wow. Okay. And in terms of, and I've said this before in committee and in many other committees, in terms of policies that are implemented with very little disregard to consultation from our tribes and our pueblos. My question is, has there been any type of consultation with the Pueblo nations since March on this particular issue? Even before, I mean, I guess, was there any consultation before March? Has there been any consultation since then?
Madam Chair, I can't speak for any of the pueblos at this time. I honestly can't tell you what kind of consultation has taken place up to this point. I do know that, you know, my tribal council at Santa Clara has been very tied up with response to COVID and has been under limited capacity to respond to these kind of environmental concerns. You know, looking from the outside looking in, but yeah, I can't speak to that, of what kind of consultation has actually taken place. There might be some kind of presentation happening at the APCG meeting the end of the month, but why is that happening when they're due to start in 2 days? You know, it's a little after the fact.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that. I know that this is certainly something that I'm interested in following up on. And so if there's other members within the committee who are, please let me know. But I think one of the things that I think the questions that we need to maybe be asking is, what are safe levels of exposure to this? And I know that part of your presentation earlier was related to pregnant women and how this is impacting their public health, and there seems to be a lot of uncertainty around how much will be released over time, and then how that venting is actually going to impact not necessarily just pregnant women, but just all people who are living in the area, because it's still unclear what kind. I mean, I'm not an expert on any of these issues related when it comes to this particular tritium or tritium, but I do know that based on what I've read, it's something that we should all be concerned about, and I'm very much happy to follow up on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, there really is no safe levels of radionuclides when it comes to Indigenous pregnant families. And when I ask that we center that model as the standard for protection, that really is vital to the health and well-being of our state, and all of our communities can benefit from that. But yeah, there has not been any in-depth studies around what is levels that, which really I don't really think there are, when it comes to our unborn. And so there has to be other alternatives to what they're planning to do in a couple days.
And that was going to actually be one of my questions, Ms. Osi, in terms of, because there hasn't been any much tribal consultation on this venting, but I know that there's always some conversations in preparation for things like this. Are there some ideas that you all have discussed in terms of alternatives for what open air venting looks like? Is that were any of those alternatives ever proposed by the EPA?
There was not any proposed alternatives to the EPA. But yeah, I do think that we need to halt this and enact a public process where we discuss these alternatives and they're put on the table. And yeah, why the urgency, when these are from Cold War era drums that have been sitting there all this time at TA 54, where there's a lot of things that are unstable in that building, not just these. So yeah, there's a lot of questions that the public deserves answers to, and other options that, the health and well-being of our peoples deserve to be discussed as well.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Ms. Stringer, if you can, I know that you wanted to add to that topic as well.
Okay, there's a little triangle above my microphone, so I'm hoping you all can hear me. It sounds like you can. Okay. So I wanted to point out that I know the letter went out this morning saying that it could happen September 11th. I just wanted to let you all know that they can't proceed with that tritium venting until they have a decision from the Environment Department regarding a temporary authorization request. And that decision has not been rendered, so they cannot proceed until that piece is closed. And the other piece of information is that we had a briefing from EPA and DOE, and they did indicate there was outreach to the surrounding pueblos. So just to clarify that there has been some level of outreach that's been done. It's my understanding they provided a technical presentation to them to explain the process that was going to be used. So this is still an ongoing issue at the department. And, certainly in the last temporary authorization that we approved for the WIP facility, we can't require regulatorily, but we encourage them to do a significant amount of public outreach, which they did follow our advice and reached out to the public for that. So I think I'll just stop there. I just wanted to jump in and provide that information to the committee to let everyone know.
Thank you, Mrs. Stringer, and I appreciate that. I guess for me, and like many of us who serve in the legislature and those of us who do a lot of work in public service, is that COVID has, and I've said this over and over again, that COVID has unveiled to us so many inequities that have existed prior to COVID, and one of which is access to like broadband, for example. And so when we talk about public outreach, that doesn't necessarily mean that the consultation that's being done in our Native and Indigenous communities actually are maybe as effective, because it's probably some of the most hard hit when it comes to COVID, and also where they lack the most access to technology. And so I just wanted to raise that, because I don't want to be so much of an alarmist, but the fact of the matter is that if the venting was to be halted for the purpose of the pandemic, and then if there's folks who feel that it's suddenly coming back into where it's going to happen this rapidly, I think is just concerning in a lot of different levels, just because there's a variety of different people who I think are going to be impacted by this issue. And so I'd certainly love to continue to have this conversation with you all at the department, and just trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And so I want to take the time to just say that I don't have anybody else on the list to ask for any questions. But Ms. Ahrens, did you want to say something?
Releasing tritium during the pandemic, because it will be in the air, will damage lots of people. And the fact that the Environment Department is even considering a temporary authorization for this material that can be safely stored, as it has been stored for years. There's also another piece of this, is that under the Triad's contract, one of their performance requirements for this fiscal year is to vent 5 more containers that are larger, that contain more tritium, by September 30th. So we feel like they're trying to get permission to vent this on Friday, these 4 containers, so that they can vent the other 5 before the end of the fiscal year, so they can get their bonus. And this is a pattern and practice by DOE to do things in order to get the bonuses for not only for their contractors. And it's of grave concern, and I would plead with Ms. Stringer to deny the temporary authorization. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ahrens. Secretary, did you have anything that I didn't know if you had raised your hand or not?
Yeah, Madam Chair, thank you. I appreciate that this topic came up, and appreciate Joni just mentioning what she did, and would love to get that information. But Madam Chair, the tritium issue is one that I sat with DOE and said that this is the venting issue. I wanted to understand what they were venting quantity-wise, how they were capturing that. So the intent is to not just vent into the atmosphere, but to vent and capture that emission. And again, I'm not advocating, I'm telling you what I know, just to be clear. But they were venting to capture that. As they depressurize the cylinders, that tritium will come out. That's what's building the pressure, making those cylinders unsafe for continued storage there. But it's really put New Mexico in a bad position, because these containers have been neglected for so long by both DOE and the Environment Department. We're in this position. So the position is, do they vent those tritium drums, collect that emission to prevent it from being in the air, and then move those drums off site? Or do we run the risk of leaving those drums on site knowing that they are pressurized and could rupture, meaning an unreleased, an uncontrolled amount of tritium would go out? I do not like the position that our department is in. I think this goes towards the fact that DOE did not do something sooner, and it goes to the fact that our department has been so underfunded, we don't have the staff to go and hold people accountable to do those things in a timely manner. So we're in a very bad position. I recognize there's no win here for our department. As you pointed out, EPA controls the emissions. I have no legal jurisdiction over those emissions. I have jurisdiction over what's in the drums once the emission's gone, which is a lead residue. That's a hazardous waste that we're able to manage from a regulatory perspective, but EPA is really on the hook here. And do I think folks in Dallas can oversee what happens in New Mexico as effectively as I can? Absolutely not. But we're in a bad situation, and the fact that DOE maybe has not done all the consultation with tribes and pueblos, as well as other New Mexicans, it bothers me that is the situation we're in. So we have not preordained anything. The request is into us. We're evaluating it. But I recognize that no matter what we do here, there is some degree of risk to the public on both ends of the spectrum. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary, for that. And yeah, I think that's quite the predicament that we're all in. And I know that when you're, I mean, there's a lot of things that I keep thinking about. I mean, this is only my 4th year serving in the legislature, and to know the entire history around, or to try to grasp the entire history of our legacy, the nuclear legacy in the state, and then trying to address it now in the 21st century. I completely understand that there's a lot of challenges, and so I appreciate your explanation and things that you all are working on. Do you know more or less what the timeline what that does look like in terms of getting, if they've already submitted this, are you all held up to a certain deadline that you have to respond, or is there no such thing, or how does that work?
Madam Chair, for a temporary authorization, we would typically act on those. We wouldn't delay unless we didn't have the information or something to that effect. A concern that I caught this morning in talking with Stephanie is the actual coordination that's required under a temporary authorization, the notification to community members. While DOE did reach out in March for an April venting, as was indicated earlier, the fact that I don't know that they've reached out to people to vent tritium in September, if you will. So we're still doing our due diligence as required under law for us to be able to evaluate on its face value a temporary authorization.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I appreciate that. Ms. Ahrens, if you can mute your mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to let you know that you were you weren't unmuted. No, well, thank you all very, very much for your presentation and for your willingness to come forward and to speak on behalf of these issues. Again, I recognize that they're all very complex and very, very complicated, and there's a ton of layers to a lot of these different issues. And so I really appreciate you all taking the time. I'd love to, again, follow up on this one specifically to just see where this goes moving forward in the next few days. So thank you all. So next and on the last of the agenda for today is again, Ms. Stringer, you've been so patient with us all day long as part of the main person on some of these issues. But if you'd like to begin, we're on the last agenda item.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My slides are getting pulled up. So the topic to be covered next is an update on the Kirtland Air Force Base bulk fuel facility spill, as well as an update on the Pfas contamination. So those are the topics I'm covering. Next slide, please. Everyone has to have a title slide. There we go. So, I hate to keep reiterating this point, but we just can't get away from it. The resources at the New Mexico Environment Department are very limited, and that affects the work that needs to be done and the work that's expected to be done by not only members of the legislature, but also members of the public. So I'm highlighting the area within the Hazardous Waste Bureau that focuses on the Kirtland Air Force Base activities as well as the Pfas activities. Again, you can see here, in the entire Hazardous Waste Bureau, I've got 35 positions, including the Bureau Chief. As mentioned earlier, Lanol's got thousands and thousands of people working on some of these tasks. So we're operating on a shoestring, and again, that just impacts the results. Okay, on to the next slide. So again, that works. If we have questions about the resources, I feel like I've made that point. Always happy to make it again. But again, I'm trying not to reiterate things I've presented to the committee in the past. So my last presentation on this topic is available at the link provided. Next slide, please. A little bit of background, just the regulations that are driving me and where my obligations lie and where my authority lies are, coming from the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act, and the Hazardous Waste Permit and Corrective Action Fee regulations. Kirtland, under this particular project, this is all governed through the permitting process and under the permit, whereas with our topic earlier on the Lanol cleanup, that's governed under the consent order as well as the permit. So that's just a distinction I thought I'd point out here. So again, it contains all of the requirements for corrective action process. We've got an administrative record on our website that publishes a lot of the associated documents, and we've got the link to that there. So that's just a little background. Next slide, please. So this is where I'm really going to focus most of my discussion. I've tried to capture the process in general. I don't want to oversimplify it. It's very complicated, but I feel like we've spent a lot of time talking to the stakeholders and the public and even this committee about the specific details that are going on with the, groundwater pump and treat plants and the bioremediation. And I wanted to bring everybody up a level and talk about the process, where we are, where we're headed, and timeframes associated with that. So Secretary and I created this graphic to try to capture a lot of information to share with you and to trigger conversation. So this is the corrective action process in general. You start off with a facility assessment phase where you're just confirming that there is in fact contamination. So that's definitely clear in the case of the bulk fuel facility spill. We know there's contamination there, so that phase is complete. Then you move on to the facility investigation, and this is where it's a lot of scientific data collection, analysis to determine the nature and the extent of the contamination, while also concurrently exploring ideas and pilot tests about how the contamination can be addressed. So this is the area that this project has been stuck in for quite some time. And so after you get through that step in the process, you would move on to the corrective measures evaluation. And that's when you're starting to think about what the options are to finally come up with the solution to the cleanup and come up with a plan to get to that point. There are activities going on that are supporting that effort right now. but I would say it's in the very early stages. And then after you do that evaluation process, that's when it comes back to NMED to select the final remedies, the final actions that are going to tell the permittee, in this case, the Kirtland Air Force Base, exactly what they need to do to clean it up and finish the project. And that final stage is called the corrective measures implementation. We're not near that stage right now. So what I've been working on over the last year is really doing the technical analysis, investing in the relationship development to figure out how we can move this along, what data we might need to fill in the gaps, and figuring out all of the technical scientific aspects that feed into this so that we can get out of being stuck in this facility investigation phase and move on to the next phases. So there's a lot of data available for this project because this investigation phase has been going on for quite some time. And so working collaboratively with Kirtland, we've talked about how can we streamline reviews, how can we all be most effective in implementing this project and doing it in the right way. So I feel like we're in a good spot that we're going to come out of this facility investigation phase and get to a corrective measures evaluation and move towards that remedy selection. And our goal, our target date that we're trying to kind of come up with significant milestones and a time frame for, so we're shooting to move into that and get there by the end of 2021. And again, takes a lot of resources to do that. So there's some assumptions that we're making in this plan. But again, that's the way we're going about achieving progress and ultimately success for cleaning up the bulk fuel facility spill. And I've got one more slide on this topic just to sort of take my point home. Next slide, please. This takes relationship building. It takes collaboration with the entire community. So I've got kind of the faces of the people in these groups that we're trying to engage with. One of our challenges is making sure we do engage the stakeholders in a meaningful way. And if we could go, I just want to show you that slide, but go back to the previous slide, please. I've got on here the opportunity for a formal public hearing occurs at the point in which we select the final remedy. But we want to make sure there's public involvement and stakeholder engagement throughout the entire process. So I want to do that, again, in a very meaningful way, but making sure we're getting through the process and we're not hung up unnecessarily on certain aspects of the project. So that's a challenge that I face on a daily basis. We want to make sure we get all the feedback that we need in the right times, and we incorporate that and move the project along. So that's kind of my summary presentation on Kirtland. We'll move on and I'll finish the presentation on PFAS and then we can go back to questions based on how this is run. I do have one more slide just on Kirtland Air Force Base to show that there is progress going on, even though I've set it out in a very linear fashion in the process. You have small successes throughout the course of the project, and you can see here through a demonstration of how the EDB plume has been reduced over the last 4 or 5 years or so through some of the interim measures that are a component of the corrective action process. So now with that, I'll move on to the PFAS slides. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so PFAS is also handled in the Hazardous Waste Bureau, and it's kind of under the purview of the RCRA, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Hazardous Waste Act. And again, just takes a lot of resources to do all of these things. Currently, we are in litigation for PFAS contamination in New Mexico at Cannon Air Force bases and Holloman Air Force bases, and I gave you an update on that last time I was in front of this committee. But to go back to a point, that was made earlier in the first presentation about going to litigation, that's a very resource-intensive process. And so we've just got to think about what is the best strategy to really achieve progress and success in these projects. And in some cases, litigation is fully appropriate. But there's an analysis that we have to do to figure out how we're going to get the best bang for our buck, so to speak, when our resources are so limited. So again, in addition to Kirtland, this group that I've highlighted here within the Hazardous Waste Bureau works on the Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base permits, also the Melrose Air Force Range, that's a component of Cannon Air Force Base. That permit, among numerous other, large facility permits, and so just takes a lot of resources to do the work that we're doing. So we appreciate people's patience sometimes, but we all want to see it move forward, but we've got to have the ability and the capacity to do so. Next slide, please. So just a quick background on the PFAS. Again, you can look at the previous presentation that I made. I didn't want to be repetitive with that, but there is PFAS contamination here in New Mexico. PFAS is a group of chemicals that are known to be persistent in the environment, particularly in groundwater, and it is documented to have adverse health effects. There's no drinking water standard for PFAS. Yet it's just a lifetime health advisory level that is sort of the driving number for what we consider to trigger us to say, yes, there's contamination, and that's not good enough. The presence of PFAS is just not a good thing. And so we're doing everything we can to prevent further contamination as well as clean up known contamination. So with that, NMED has its regulatory authority for PFAS not only in the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, but also in the Groundwater Quality Act. So in this case, the PFAS, there's a Groundwater Quality Act violation in that program. I will say that the water programs are in a different division, and so I'm really focused more on the Resource Protection Division's purview over PFAS contamination, but there's a huge water component that we could talk about for many hours on end as well. So in 2018, the Department of Defense disclosed that there was contamination at Cannon and Holloman Air Force bases, and NMED took immediate action and responded to that. And to the extent that our response included working with the State Attorney General in 2019, we sued the Department of Defense seeking action on the imminent and substantial endangerment to public health and the environment caused by that pollution. So that's the litigation that we are in right now. And in addition to that, the water quality programs are overseeing aspects of enforcement on PFAS activities as well. Next slide, please. So just to sort of put it in a graphic demonstration of where we are in the process of PFAS contamination cleanup, we're not even complete with the facility assessment phase. So there's been contamination of PFAS confirmed at Cannon and Holloman Air Force bases, but we haven't really looked for it everywhere that we need to be looking for it. And so that's going to be a component of our strategy in addressing PFAS, is looking to see where it actually is within the state. And again, that takes more resources. But so specific to Cannon Air Force Base and Holloman Air Force Base cleanup activities, the RCRA facility investigation phase has just started. There's very, very limited data available that's necessary to determine the comprehensive nature and extent of the contamination at those two sites. And so, our expectation is that the responsible party steps up and fulfills the obligations to determine the nature and extent. When we didn't see that happening to our satisfaction, that's of course the basis for us pursuing the litigation. And so we're not even anywhere near getting into figuring out how to truly clean up the PFAS contamination, because we've got to first figure out where it is. Not to say that there's not work being done in that regard, but just in a sort of where we are in the process as a whole to get to that point, we have a lot more data needs to drive that process. Next slide, please. Is there one more? Okay. So the next steps, we haven't seen the responsible party gathering the data that's necessary to feed into that process. So the NMED is taking a proactive approach. We got a legislative appropriation to begin that process or further it along with $1 million. And we're using that appropriation to characterize and delineate the contamination. So we're working on that project now. We're kind of in the early stages of procuring a contractor to do that work. But that was one mechanism that we could actually see something happening, was to seek funding to move the project along and collect the data that's needed to get to the point where we can start cleaning it up. And then again, just the litigation continues. Litigation is a slow process. So, there's potential for going through that approach to effect cleanup. It significantly slows cleanup down. So that's always a consideration when we're weighing our options. But that was the appropriate action in this case. It was combined with product liability actions against PFAS manufacturers in the U.S. District Court in South Carolina. NMED, we did try to remove ourselves from that, but the court denied our motion to leave, rather. So we're still in the multi-district litigation, and that's where that stands. And I think that was my last slide. I have it printed. I guess I could just look at my hard copy. But that concludes my presentation, and I stand for questions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Stringer. And I haven't received any notice of anyone who has questions. I have a couple comments, but in the meantime, if folks want to raise their hand or give me some sort of signal that you're interested in providing questions, let me know. I think one of the things that I've heard, probably the biggest narrative from today and from some of the things that I've heard from your presentation is the issue with capacity, and then just the issues with budgets. And I just want to remind folks who have been listening or watching all day, and I don't have to tell this to any of the legislators on the call, but for a very long time, for many, many years, I think the Environment Department has been trying to recover from cuts that were made. Between 2012 and 2019, there was a 32% cut to the department. There was a 9% increase in 2019, but that was only to begin to try to bring, I guess, life back into the Environment Department. Especially when it comes to inspecting issues related to air, issues related to groundwater, and then, of course, the issues that we're trying to figure out today, which is a lot of hazardous materials that we are attempting to find some relief for. And so I just bring that up because this is what happens when we live within the boundaries of really it's short-sighted, the fact that we are not investing in departments like this one, but it's also very, very problematic in that it's a deficit mentality that we have, that it actually costs us more not to be able to figure out solutions to many of these issues rather than just investing in these issues. And I know the secretary isn't here anymore, but Ms. Stringer, I was going to ask you a question, and you probably don't know the answer to it. I don't know, but I'm hoping that you might. What would it cost the state to actually fully fund the Environment Department to be able to do all the things that you all need to have done in order to put New Mexico back in a track where we're actually not only just addressing issues related to all the issues that we've discussed today, but even just in other committees that I've been on the last couple weeks, where we're talking about issues related to air and like methane and things like that, and then of course related to groundwater, there's not enough inspectors to be able to go out and to review a lot of these things. Like, if you had a magic wand, what would be that cost, or what would be that investment amount for the state to actually invest in the environment department to really put us back on track?
Madam Chair, thank you for that question. We did actually try to do an analysis to figure that out. So, I would say take this number with a grain of salt, but in the most recent analysis, just to sort of get back to the core functionality that had been cut for so many years, it was looking at a $10 million increase to the department's budget to be able to do that. So I know the secretary's got information on the analysis that we did to kind of come up with that baseline amount, and I might be off on that number, but that's my recollection of the final number that we came to.
Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Stringer. And I know that we're moving into a legislative session come January where, I mean, the issue around money again is going to be an issue. Like, we are already being prepared as legislators to say that there is going to be no money. I know that the governor's already instructed all of the departments to consider looking at across the board cuts, and so I recognize the issue around. I recognize that the issue, this global issue that we have with COVID, but also with the oil and gas industry. But this is the very issue that I keep bringing up over and over again, and I know many of my colleagues bring it up as well, is how do we further diversify our economy so that we're not so heavily reliant on these industries that we know for a fact, we've seen it over and over again, that it not only impacts our revenues and our opportunities for economic development, but it also really handcuffs many of our families across the state who are unable to really prepare for the future, much like New Mexico. The fact that as a legislature, we can't prepare 3, 5, 10 years ahead because of our because we're so dependent on these industries, to me says that we have a ton of work to do. But then when does that work even begin when we can't, when it's just hard to, it's like a catch-22. And so I think that's the biggest frustration for me as a legislator, and I'm sure it's a big frustration to you all as well, that you're just trying to do your job, but capacity is limited and all of that. And so anyways, thank you so much, Ms. Stringer, for your presentation. If there's no one else, I'm looking at the screen right now. Representative or Senator Gonzalez, if you want to, if you have a question.
Madam Chair, thank you. And first, I was going to go on the same thought of, what you asked now with how much funding is being needed. The only part that I would add is, would we expect some of that to be federal, or would it be all state?
Madam Chair, Representative Gonzalez, that amount is strictly for the general fund increase that would be necessary to fully fund the department, taking into account the existing federal grants that we do receive, the required match that's necessary to bring those federal dollars in, as well as, the special revenue funds that also fund the agencies. So that amount was limited to just general fund across the entire department. And also I should note that our federal funds within the Hazardous Waste Bureau are projected to decrease by 10%. It's on my slide and I just forgot to make a note of that to the committee. But so we're losing, federal dollars are being cut. And then we need just more investment by the state to fund our programs. But I would also sort of look at the positive side of that, is we are getting creative on how we can become more enterprise. We had a number of proposals through the legislature last year that included fee increases. And so my, I guess, ask for this committee is to be supportive of the proposals that seek creative ways to help fund the department, knowing that, you know, we just really can't ask for more general fund given the circumstances that exist right now. So the secretary is being really creative on how we can come up with some ideas to support the department in a way that enables us to do our core functions. And we're also looking at areas where we may have to disinvest and be very realistic that we just can't support some programs. You know, can we do everything a very, you know, spread so thin that we're not really being effective with some of the programs? And so we need to think about what are some programs that might just have to go away because we're not doing a good job because we don't have the capacity to implement them. That's hard when you work in an agency that is protecting the environment and public health, because all of our programs are being driven by that mission. And so nobody wants to cut areas that might negatively impact public health. And I'll stop there.
Well, I might just want to add, Madam Chair, that you know, perhaps one of your proposals could be to like maybe on a 3-4 year increment, and you know, to achieve that. But I really do consider it, you know, on the basis of being a, you know, at the point of an emergency, you know, and we have to do something. So, you know, if that comes through, you know, I'd be more than glad to work with you or with the department, or, you know, and have others join us on the importance of this. And, you know, it was mentioned that we've been working on this for quite some time, and I will say it has been a long time, and we just can't keep going on to, you know, hoping for the good year to come by. But I think if we can come up with a plan that we could do it on small increments, but eventually with a goal to get there. And that's my suggestion, and that's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Brown?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Stringer, I sit on the House Appropriations Committee, and what I've learned is we have many agencies in state government that have vacancies. So the legislature has appropriated money to pay people to fill those chairs, but departments are oftentimes unable to hire people. So my question is, what is the vacancy rate in your department, if you happen to know that at this time?
Madam Chair, Representative Brown, I believe the vacancy rate is somewhere around 25 to 30% across the board. You know, I often focus more on my programs. The vacancy rate for the Hazardous Waste Bureau was given in my resource slides. But it's very complex. So the vacancy rate just in and of itself, there's definitely context that needs to be shared. It's difficult to recruit at the pay scales that we pay, that we can afford. The private sector certainly pays more. The process is very burdensome to get through. And so, you know, I know this administration is looking at how they can improve the hiring process so that it's done in a, you know, more efficient manner. And then there's just time for the existing supervisors to devote to hire. So that's a plethora of reasons and excuses. But I know from my perspective, as a director, I see that we're always working to fill those vacancies. And when you put in weeks, sometimes months into a hire, only to come out of it with no one willing to take your offer, or no, you know, not having filled a position, it's devastating to go through that process. So yes, it's kind of a double-edged sword to fill the vacancies in a timely manner and build that capacity.
Right, Madam Chair and Ms. Stringer. So if work isn't being done, it's probably because people haven't been hired, or, you know, it's been hard to find people to take those positions. So that is across state government. It's not unique to your department. But my position has been, if we, from year to year to year, are funding vacant positions, why are we parking money rather than putting it to use somewhere? So my advice to agency heads is do a better job if you can of hiring people in. And I know our Department of Transportation really has, I think, has had a higher percentage of vacancies even than your department. So I just bring that up. We're going to certainly grapple with that in January. So thank you for your answer. I appreciate it. Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you, Representative. It doesn't look like we have anyone else on the list to speak unless you turn on your camera real quick and wave at me. Otherwise, we can move on to public comment. I know that we have quite a few folks online who are interested in hearing or wanting us to hear what they have to say. But Ms. Stringer, thanks again for participating today and for your presentation. We really appreciate it. And so thank you again.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. Appreciate it.
So I know that there's a list of attendees that are here. And then I think we have about 5. So if you all are still on, if we'll be able to unmute them. I think Seth is helping out to unmute folks. So I'll just be going through the folks that I see on the attendees list, and then Seth, if you can just go ahead and unmute them. Cynthia Wheeler, if you can go ahead, please.
Me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, Madam Chair and committee members, thank you. I'm Cynthia Wheeler. I grew up in Roswell at Walker Air Force Base, but I currently live in Santa Fe. And boy, howdy, I can understand Ms. Stringer's frustration. This is really a huge issue. But the other issue I'm finding that I'm running up against all the time as just a citizen is lack of transparency. And I want to thank Representative Chandler for her emphasis on the need for transparency and also action. But whether we have the money or not, we're facing a public health emergency here. And I want to go back to the tritiated water and ask that the committee help us move the Environment Department to not allow the release of tritiated water to the atmosphere. Ms. Sosi explained this so well, and I'm not an expert on social justice or health issues, but I am a chemistry teacher, and so I'm able to think this through using that logic. This is radioactive water. The radioactive atom is part of the water molecule, and it acts like any other water molecule. So it's inhaled as water vapor, or it's ingested when plants and animals take it up and they're eaten. And I can't emphasize how important this is. Water is needed by life because it's the solvent, it's the medium, it's the means by which all the work is done inside the cells. This puts that alpha radiation right inside your cells, next to the machinery, including the DNA that cells use to keep you alive. So even the suggestion of releasing this radioactive water, so citizens inhale it and aren't even aware of it, is really horrifying. And if nothing else, the decision should never be made on the basis of a contractor bonus. I'm also concerned about the WIP expansion, the fact that the New Mexico Environment Department is not really holding the DOE to the agreement that it made in 1992. And so the agreement was to only take 6.2 million cubic feet of waste. It was a pilot program to see if burying the waste in a salt dome was feasible, and it was to end in 2024. Other sites were supposed to be found for storage in other states. And it seems that the DOE is just changing the rules and moving the goalposts, and the New Mexico Environment Department isn't advocating for us and standing up to this bully. I think the reason that the DOE shows deference to Idaho and South Carolina is because they say no in ways that the DOE understands. I Going back to transparency, I'm offended that this expansion of WIP is being done without getting input from the public. By the time I even heard about it, there was 1 week left in which to tell others and to comment. I, along with thousands of others, live along the designated transport route that this increased amount of waste will travel. We're the ones who will suffer the consequences of the decisions that are being made, and we're not given the ability to give input. It stands to reason that those with the most to lose must have the loudest voices, and we've been given silence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Wheeler. Next, we have Leona Morgan. Leona Morgan, are you there? We'll move ahead to Susan Sherman.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent. Hopefully Leona will be able to figure out her audio issues. So thank you very much. My name is Susan Skirman. I'm a member of the Nuclear Issues Study Group. I appreciate the opportunity to make a comment today. I've been listening since about 10:30. First of all, I want to echo Beata Sosi Peña's comments from Table Women United. We oppose the tritium release into the air. If a release is necessary, it must be in a contained manner that can be captured. And I guess I'm wondering, can this committee block the release? Can you pressure the EPA? Can you pressure the NMED to withhold the temporary authorization? Secondly, about the plutonium pit production expansion. We oppose expanding production. We do not consent to this massive expansion at Lanol. We should cease creating nuclear bombs. We should cease creating nuclear waste. We should change the mission of Lanol and Sandia National Labs to focus 100% on creating innovative solutions to the daunting challenge of what to do with the waste we currently have. We need to do restorative justice for all impacted communities around the world, from the nations who have tested nuclear bombs and who use nuclear power, including the downwinders from the Trinity test, the downwinders from testing on the Western Shoshone, victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, people living in the Marshall Islands, people living near uranium mines, on the Navajo Nation, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The mission of nuclear weapons labs should be directed to cleaning up the mountains of waste we already have on our planet. We must stop creating nuclear waste now. We support the treaty to ban nuclear weapons. 44 nations have signed that treaty. We urge that the United States also sign. We oppose Holtec bringing spent nuclear fuel to New Mexico. We strongly urge the NMED to order Sandia National Lab to clean up the mixed waste landfill in Albuquerque. New Mexico is not a nuclear wasteland, nor is it a sacrifice zone. The contamination must be stopped and cleaned up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Skirman. Next, we have Joe Carrillo.
Oh, sorry. You guys can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, committee members. And I just want to express my appreciation to Ms. Sosi and Mr. Mello and the NMED staff for providing their clear information and the presentations that they provided. And I want to speak just briefly and kind of directly to the question of the lab expansion and touch on the record of Lanol and its contractors, which to no surprise of anybody here is dismal. The lack of clarity and the lack of oversight has been troubling over the last couple of decades. And I'll leave the question of balancing, R&D and weapons production and contractor oversight to experts like Mr. Mello. They've been observing and engaging on those activities for decades. But I did want to ask as a citizen, what is the future for New Mexico with respect to Lanol? economic, cultural, creative. I grew up here in New Mexico. I have family members, colleagues, and friends who've worked in and around the labs, are from northern New Mexico. Their grandparents and ancestors are from a wide range of places. And so when you ask that question, you know, what is the future with respect to Lanol? I just don't see any way around it. There isn't a future. It's not a future for any of us, nor for our children or grandchildren. And so anything that we do today or in the near or midterm is trading the future for our children and our grandchildren. And I really do think it's pretty clear if we could trust Lanol, either at the operator or the federal oversight level, we would already know. And I really doubt that anybody who's sort of worked in or around this issue over the last decades, you know, could reasonably say that we can trust Lanol. It just isn't. And so I think that's part of what the pandemic is really revealing right now, as it pushes hard on all of our communities across New Mexico. Is it's revealing some of those longstanding problems, and I think that is really, really clear. And so I'll just sort of close by saying, you know, if you love outdoors, ranching, camping, hunting, recreation, Lanol it's not a future. If you care about our state's creative and cultural resources, our people, our tribes and sovereign nations, Lanol is not the future. If you want to see your children and your grandchildren have opportunities economically and socially, Lanol is just not the future. And if you want to see small businesses, entrepreneurs thrive and reinforce our communities, it's just not the future. And so I think that's something we all need to keep in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Cardio. Next, we have Justine Tiba.
Hello, my name is Justine Tiba. I am from the pueblos of Santa Clara, Tesuque, Acoma Pueblo. I am a member of the Red Nation and a member of the Pueblo Feminist Caucus. I'm calling because I am very disturbed that by the news that they are trying to release radioactive vapor into Tewa airspace. It is this disturbing irony that in our most sacred holy sites in the entire world is also the site where the deadliest weapon to ever exist was created. I've got news that this is a radioactive vapor release, meaning that these water vapors will be absorbed into the watershed all over Tewa Valley, including into bodies and into our crops, which we are still harvesting. Radioactive. I'm new to learning all of this, and part of the reason why I'm even more disturbed is it has taken me over a quarter of a century to learn that these are issues that are even going on. All of the radioactive poisoning going on, happening directly from Lanol, has been happening my entire life, and it's taken me over 25 years to learn of this. This is happening without the consent of my relatives, of my people. It has happened without my consent. I believe that the radioactive poisoning that has happened, that's not only going to happen this Friday, but that has been happening over the decades, that poisoning, I believe, results in my own infertility. It has given my grandfather a tumor, given my auntie a tumor, has resulted in another auntie's birth defects and severe asthma. And these are all things that we are not told about our entire lives. And it has taken me over 25 years to even make the connections to Lanol for all of these health problems that are being implemented on Tewa people. And the continuation of poisoning us and our lands it leaves us without even having the ability to sustain ourselves, when we can't even harvest our own crops because they are contaminated, when our water is contaminated, when our clay that we use in our pots is contaminated, when the animals are contaminated. This is ongoing genocide. This is what 21st century genocide looks like. And it's not like we can just pack up our things and leave. These are our homelands and they're being poisoned, all in the name of nuclear colonialism. And I just want to echo what others have said too, is we should be stopping nuclear production entirely. And there's not a lot that I can say on the specifics of this entire process, but what I do know is that it poisons an entire valley of people, an entire watershed, and the tritium release is happening without the consent of the All Pueblo Governors Council, without the consent of all sovereign nations that are around Lanol, and without the consent of people who live within the valley of where all of this nuclear poisoning is happening. It's an utter disgrace that you think that Lanol thinks that they can do this after all of these years without the consent of Indigenous people, because they know that they'll never get that consent. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Tiba. Next we have Leona Morgan. Are you available this time?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I totally support all of the comments made by the community members. Today, I'm speaking as an individual. I would like to just remind folks, I guess I could reintroduce myself. I presented last November to the committee about Holtec, and so today I want to cover a few topics. But I'm adjusting my mic, so I want to make sure you can hear me in 1 second. Can you hear me still? Okay,
Yes,
perfect.
we can hear you.
Okay, so I am Danae. My family is traditionally from northwestern New Mexico and has been impacted by the past uranium mining, which led to the work that I do today, which is mostly focusing on popular education of all these issues because of the reasons that were just stated before, that most of us grow up in New Mexico not even knowing that we are at risk of exposure from so many nuclear facilities. And so today, listening to the comments about the budget and the lack of all the vacancies that are out there, it's very concerning that we don't really know what's happening in our state regarding the radioactive releases from Lanol. I think some of these things really need to be publicized much better. I support all of the work that's being done by the community groups, and they really are the experts, and I highly recommend that you all consult with the community folks who are being impacted, especially the frontline community people. There are the Indigenous folks who've been living here for centuries, and we should be at the table and have a say when these things occur. But also there are the community experts like Mr. Mello and Joni Ahrens, who spoke earlier. These are very important and dangerous things happening to New Mexico residents, and most of us are not aware. I think it should be, all of the topics somehow should be, there should be a segment on the news to let folks know downstream and downwind, because this was not afforded to us during the Church Rock spill of 1979. In fact, it was hidden, and many Diné people were impacted for lack of knowledge. If we were just informed when these things happen, of course, we're going to be against it. But the most important thing is transparent information to the public. I just want to shift topics a little bit to the WIP expansion. This is another issue we need to be aware of. And I really don't like that our state is being targeted to take waste from other states. Right now, the closure date, 2024, needs to be respected and kept in place. And I think the priority for WIP needs to be to clean up New Mexico communities, not other sites across the country. We're seeing this happen right now with the Holtec proposal. So now I'm shifting topics again. I think the best way for us as New Mexico to protect ourselves is not to open ourselves up to more nuclear production and accepting nuclear waste, especially from other states. I just want to give a quick update to your committee about the Holtec application. This is the proposal that was really the path toward this proposal was paved by the Eddie Lee Energy Alliance, who should be held accountable for anything that will happen in the future. They invited Holtec to build this facility, which is they're proposing to store up to more than double the amount of waste that exists in the country today. And right now, they've started their application, which is currently going through the NEPA process, and we're dealing with the draft environmental impact statement. What happened just recently, see in 2018, when Holtec, when their application was going through the scoping phase, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission held 5 meetings around the state. These were in-person hearings that were attended by hundreds of New Mexico residents, the majority opposing Holtec. Of course, there were some proponents, but the point is they held 5 in-person meetings at various locations. And this year, because of the pandemic, the NRC is using this international crisis to push forward the application by Holtec by not holding in-person meetings. They say that they need to continue with the process, but in reality, there really is no rush. There should be no rush for such an unprecedented project. This would be the largest nuclear waste dump in the whole world, and we were not afforded any in-person hearings this year. Letters were sent to the NRC by our congressional delegation, and I'm urging you as a committee to also follow up with this, because our senators and representatives in Congress told the NRC they need to pause the process until it is safe to have in-person meetings again, and that they asked, they again, when the NRC publicized that they're not going to do in-person meetings, that they're going to do 4 webinars that require both an internet connection and a phone line. This is an EJ violation, because most of us in the state, not everybody has the luxury of internet in the home, and also, you know, some places don't even have cell reception in the state. But this is an issue because when the NRC announced that it's going to do this, our 2 senators replied saying these 4 additional webinars should only be considered as supplemental until the in-person meetings are still held. So we're maintaining that the NRC needs to pause its process, and we're not talking about extending the comment deadline. The letters clearly stated pause the process, which means completely stop until the coronavirus pandemic has ended and it's safe to consider these things, especially for all of our citizens across the state to be able to weigh in. So I'm hoping that your committee and the entire state of New Mexico can really get the resources it needs should this project go forward. Because as we've seen in the past, NRC allows self-regulation. And if we don't have the staff, the state staff, to be out there making sure they're not messing up our environment, we should not allow this to happen at all. So thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I really appreciate the time given to speak today and all of the work that you all do for our residents.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan. Next, we have Eileen O'Shaughnessy.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, representatives, for convening today. My name is Eileen O'Shaughnessy. I'm an educator and an organizer in Albuquerque. I'm also the co-founder of the Nuclear Issues Study Group. And I want to thank you for convening today to talk about issues of radioactive and hazardous materials. As we've heard today, New Mexico is extremely overburdened, I think unfairly so, when it comes to hazardous and radioactive materials. And it must be noted that the environmental risks and negative health impacts of these materials are disproportionately borne by Indigenous communities and communities of color. There are multiple quantitative and qualitative studies, including the 1987 Toxic Waste and Race report that was then revisited 30 years later, that show that the siting of toxic materials in landfills and nuclear waste sites are always around communities of color and Indigenous communities. And the risks of these materials include genotoxic impacts, DNA damage, which will ripple far into the future, long after we are all gone. So the Los Alamos National Labs and the nuclear industry at large continues to operate via secrecy as their main operative in order to hide the disastrous environmental impacts and the human rights violations that are continuous. So this is why we must take leadership not from Lanol, who continues to cause harm, but from Indigenous people, from Tewa people, who are the most impacted by especially the harm caused by Lanol. And I want to thank Beata especially for her words and Tewa Women United and Pueblo Action Alliance for their leadership on that. I was appalled to hear that that NMED is so underfunded that they're, scrambling to fill these positions. Meanwhile, there's plenty of money to expand the production of nuclear weapons. And Los Alamos's cleanup program is also being underfunded. So this is the complete opposite of the direction that we need to be heading, where we are prioritizing the production of deadly materials like plutonium pits and nuclear weapons, and we are not prioritizing cleaning up the waste that we've already created. And I heard Greg Mello describe that the majority of the waste shipped from Lanol to WIPP is new waste, not legacy waste. So that's an alarming indication that cleanup will not happen, while contamination will, because the waste, the production, making plutonium pits is a dirty process, and it will create more waste. So the legacy waste continues to sit in the canyons around Los Alamos. So basically what I see happening is there's a continuing prioritizing of destruction and death over life. This is what the labs represent, nuclear colonialism. So my ask of the committee today, in whatever power you have of the regulatory bodies like NMED, is that you do whatever you can to halt this plan to vent tritium. I think it's appalling that that's even being considered during a global pandemic when public health is already in a fragile balance. I also want to echo Leona's words of caution around the Holtec proposal. We should not be taking waste from other states. We should definitely not be taking high-level nuclear waste. And I encourage this body to do whatever you can to stop the Holtec proposal. I also just want to bring back onto your radar the mixed waste landfill, which is a dump that's just outside of Albuquerque that contains legacy waste and is potentially explosive. It's in an unlined 2.5-acre pit on Sandia's property. And our group, the Nuclear Issues Study Group, we gathered comments after the 5-year review that was completed, but we have yet to hear any word from NMED and from Sandia about those comments that we submitted almost a year ago. I also want to encourage you to halt the WIPP expansion. Just across the board here, it's just a pattern that I'm seeing of moving in the direction of amping up nuclear weapons production during a time when we should be doing all we can to stop the production of nuclear weapons and to clean up these messes. And the last thing that I'll say is just to remind us that we are in a global pandemic. The health impacts of radionuclides during a time like this will be multiplied. And it's unconscionable that bodies like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the labs and even the EPA would push through environmental releases and licensing processes during a time when the entire world is at a standstill and that we're all reeling from a global pandemic. So I urge you to really take seriously the moment that we are in and prioritize public health, prioritize Indigenous leadership and life, frankly. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Shaughnessy. Next, we have Janet Greenwald. Ms. Greenwald, are you there? Okay. Ms. Janet Greenwald? No. All right. Well, that is all that we have on the list for public comment. Thank you all for joining us today. And for the committee, we're scheduled to be to host the second and last interim committee before the legislative session in January. That's scheduled for October 21st. We'll be sending out the agenda hopefully in the next few weeks. I know there was a lot of conversation around on public comment around the WIPP expansion. WIPP will certainly be on the agenda for the next hearing. And so if you have any questions, any feedback related to today's meeting, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Shauna, and we'll get back to you and hopefully try for I mean, I think today went fairly well, so hopefully we'll it'll be better next time too. So with that, you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll talk to you all soon. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you for your great work, and to everyone who participated today, to all the people presenting their public opinions and public messages and under public comment. Thank you. I'm Senator Rodriguez.